Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show brought to you by me, Harry Khawaili. The recent migrant crisis on Britain's border in Calais has raised a lot of concerns in the country. Security concerns, economic losses, and most importantly, a humanitarian issue. How are these migrants ending up at the UK border? What is France doing about it? And how is it best to tackle this invasion from Britain's perspective? And should this be dealt with here or at its source, where human trafficking is taking place? Philip Hammond, the British Foreign Secretary, said the government has a grip on the migration crisis in Calais. French police claimed British anarchists living there are manipulating migrants into using more aggressive tactics. The chaos is costing British businesses hundreds of millions of pounds, one reporting just a fifth of all deliveries it tries to make through the tunnel are now successful. Drivers queued for more than a mile to reach the ferry terminal, while migrants were seen walking along the side of the road. Let me welcome first our guest here at the studio, Professor Rodney Shakespeare. Thank you very much for being on the show, Professor of Binary Economics and renowned British non-mainstream commentator. And Mr. Stephen Bell of Stop the War Coalition and political commentator. Thank you very much for being on the show again. Before we get into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report on the crisis in Calais.
More than 1,700 attempts to cross the Eurotunnel to Britain were stopped overnight on Sunday. This comes as the UK announced new measures to crack down on desperate migrants attempting to cross over from Calais. Last week, a Sudanese man in his 30s died, apparently crushed to death by a lorry, and at least 10 people have been killed since June trying to get through the Channel Tunnel to Britain. Earlier this week, Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond announced that Britain is to fund an extra 100 border guards at the Channel Tunnel terminal on the French side, as he said the government has got a grip on the Calais migrant crisis. Hammond also announced that Britain and France would intensify their efforts for a more robust approach by the European Union to return migrants to their countries of origin and attempt to discourage migrants from travelling to Europe in the first place. More than 2,000 migrants have died trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe this year, according to the International Organization for Migrants. The organization says around 188,000 people have been rescued so far this year trying to cross the Mediterranean, and warned that the 200,000 mark could be crossed by the end of the week. Between 3,000 and 5,000 migrants are reported to be camped out in Calais waiting for a chance to cross to Britain. And the International Organization for Migrants has urged Europe to seek broader long-term measures to address the wider migrant crisis affecting the continent.
Professor Shakespeare, tell us about the media coverage of Calais between far left and far right. What do you think?
Well, those images, when they're combined with heavily emotive language, for example, the word swarms, which was used by the Prime Minister, has the effect of stimulating resentment amongst the population. On the one hand, the right wing, and particularly the right wing press, then uses this image and this language to say that we're about to be invaded by the barbarian hordes at the gates of the UK. And then the left react to that, pointing out that the issue is much bigger, much wider than what is there. I would just point out that in terms of what is happening on the big scale, one asylum applicant in the UK, and it's 9 in Germany, and it's 33 in Hungary. So before we get going off and saying what's happening, we've got to do something, etc., we have to remember that something on a much bigger scale is happening, and there are bigger issues as to whether the UK has a part in that. So the immediate thing is, though, of panic, exacerbated by the press, particularly by the right-wing press, but they are failing to see the much bigger, wider picture.
Could it be perhaps because the style of applying for asylum visas in Germany or the other countries that you mentioned is different than just crossing the border forcefully, destroying the fence and coming into your country?
The UK has natural fortress advantages. It's called the English Channel, right? But it is still part of Europe, the UK, and there are agreements and practices. And this is going to have to be addressed, including the question of, with this great flood of migrants in Europe, it's there right the way through now, is that the UK is going to have to say whether or not it does take its fair share of applicants.
Ms. Sibel, some people even say that some of the right wing in Britain are swimming in the sewer of nativism when it comes to the migrants.
I think the reason that there is such explicit racism being promoted is because the causes of this most recent migration are denied by the British government. It denies any link between population displacement and British foreign policy. The fact that they have engaged in major military campaigns in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and supporting the civil war, one side in the civil war in Syria, has created large-scale refugees. Philippe Leclerc, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, pointed out that the overwhelming body of people in Calais are from Eritrea, Afghanistan, Syria, and so on, areas of conflict. These are not people seeking to improve their lives. These are people running away from the terrors of Western foreign policy. And because David Cameron is not prepared to accept this, he reduces this to his favourite level of knee-jerk racism, a way of hardening his own party against the growth of the United Kingdom Independence Party and other right-wing forces. So it's the failure to accept their own responsibility that creates this horrifying narrative which turns people into insects, swarms.
Now, Rod Liddell, referred to as a veteran noisemaker, said, quote, "It's not a British problem, it's not an EU problem, it's a French problem. They need to sort out Calais and quick." He suggests deporting the immigrants, sending them back to their countries, their home countries. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think this is sort of simple racism, and Rod Liddell...
Why is it racism to ask people not to invade your territory and go back home?
Well, because British governments continue to invade other people's territory. And the reason that people are arriving on these shores is because we are sending armed forces to their shores. And it's time the fact that the British government grasps that fact. It cannot deny the credibly deny the link between the collapse of the Libyan state as a result of the intervention.
We'll get to foreign policy in the next section, so hold on to that thought. Professor Shakespeare, the same question. Why is it racism to control your borders? Where's the thin line here between racism and protecting the borders?
We know that in the UK, people of one skin colour are more favourably treated, have been over the years.
But they argue otherwise, to be fair.
Well, they might argue otherwise. There have been periods when skin didn't matter. I mean, after the Second World War, the West Indies provided our nurses and our bus drivers. But very generally speaking, racism is always an element in these matters. And it comes to the fore when you have the host population feeling economically insecure. And that, for all the false figures at the moment, the reality is the host population is feeling very economically insecure. And the images we've been talking about are playing on top of that, and the right wing is taking advantage of that to instigate basically what are racist feelings. But as Steve Bell has indicated earlier on, the issue goes much, much wider. We must always remember that in the past, one of the greatest countries for immigrants, putting migrants elsewhere, was this country. Some of it took in the form of imperialist activity, but the big movements were, for example, to the USA. You've always got these great attacks on people, economic stresses, The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 meant that all the Protestants were kicked out of France. You're getting that at the time. But the point being made by Steve Bell over there is that what is happening really is a consequence of our policy. And unless we address that, anybody saying, well, put the barriers up, they're just not understanding that we are part of Europe. We're going to have to solve it with Europe. And we're going to have to go behind. Perhaps we'll deal with that later.
But do you think when it comes to the barriers, it's an issue perhaps in the eyes of the government, like why not France and why should we take them? It's an inter-European issue rather than having migrants or not, because initially they didn't come to the shores of Britain, they're crossing from France, which is already in the EU, and people would argue that they have already reached a safe haven, they're no more in a war zone, so why cross into Britain?
Well, that's the British government is going to take advantage of the physical realities that there is, in fact, the channel there. And is going to do that. But behind the British situation is the government claiming that there is economic security, but all the jobs that are coming in are low-paid, temporary, part-time, minimum wage, or in the case of a lot of students, they're interns and not being paid at all. And when you have that situation, you do have a population now which is easily frightened, and the Conservative government is taking advantage of that politically. To be fair, it is happening almost independently because of the economic system. It's the bigger economic failure rather than just the present government. It's the underlying economic failure, creating the insecurity, and then always blame the migrant, find the scapegoat, etc., etc.
Mr. Bell, with the British economy being reduced in size when it comes to industry, as an industrial economy, having non-economic migrants or migrants that are not highly skilled does threaten people in England when it comes to jobs and all that. So now, obviously, you mentioned racism, but what about genuinely people who are genuinely worried about their jobs in this country?
Well, if there was no immigration into this country, then there would be a huge deepening of the economic stagnation.
Can you elaborate on this?
Because there is a net outflow of this, rather there is an outflow of between 200,000 and 300,000 people every year from this country. So you have to have some immigration into this country, even just to maintain the balance. In reality, we know, all the studies are that most migrants represent the most energetic and often the most trained section of the societies that they come from. And overall, it's clear that immigration has created great wealth in this country. People are the source of all wealth. And the failure or the failure of the government to acknowledge the significant contribution that migrant labour has played to British prosperity is a part and parcel of their refusal to address the real issues and their preparedness to fall back on traditional British racism in very the drop of a hat sometimes.
But if I may, you mentioned immigration being a wealth to the country, and I'm not challenging that, of course, but then again here we're talking perhaps about skilled immigration in an Australian style system like the government here aspires to achieve, hopefully. So when it comes to migrants who are not skilled, and like I said, it's not an heavily industrial country. Like Professor Shakespeare mentioned, they used to come here as a workforce, perhaps driving heavy vehicles or something that you could easily train and start performing. But when you don't have the language skills and other skills, education and so on, how are they going to fit in?
Well, the indication from British history is that migrants quickly learn the language and form valuable part of the community. That's the reality of the matter. And the fact is that the multiculturalism, which is denigrated, is actually a big force of production. It means that you can take the highest achievements of science, culture, and other disciplines into your daily work, your economy, your politics, your culture, and so on. And that the strength of the British economy depends upon its openness to the world. And having a large section of the population which is capable of addressing the developing markets in the language of those markets, has personal and family ties often, is a competitive advantage for the British economy. And it's necessary to make these points because they are instead we have stereotypes constantly about the refusal of migrants to integrate and so on, which is entirely the opposite of what happens. The problems are they encounter racism, not that they don't want to play a full part in British society.
Professor Shakespeare, Mr. Bell just said that they're willing to bring they're willing to integrate and learn and assimilate eventually, maybe at least when it comes to language. So those people the immigrants were in France, the ones we're talking about today, and they didn't do it apparently, and they're trying for it to happen in the UK. So why do you think it didn't work for them in France, and what would change once they come into the UK?
Well, I think ultimately it's what has been the international nature of the UK, and that the economics of the empire did depend on a much more reasonable attitude. Don't really feel that the French ever, for all the phraseology of equality, the actual realities in Algeria and the rest of it are horrific, one way or another. I think it's a point of credit to the UK that we're relatively better than the French or the Belgians, for that matter.
I guess when it comes to that, yourself and all factions in England agree on taking pride in that, the multicultural
well, yes, it has been done reasonably well. There is it comes, I think, from the history of the country, where it is, the way it's traded, and it's had to get on. And if it didn't get on with other peoples, it would not have been quite so successful. I'm not claiming that the empire was about equality. It wasn't. It was about dealing with elites and then suppress her. But overall, I think that there is that element which Steve Bell has touched on of comparative tolerance and understanding and goodwill.
So let's assume perhaps that they are hoping it will be better. There will be better welcome here once they cross that border compared to France and Belgium.
If you solve the economics of it, which is being patently failing and is going to continue failing as it is, then things ease. But at the moment, I'm afraid they're getting very much worse.
If we could get a bit off track to the previous speech of the Prime Minister, where he sort of, or people thought he alluded at that Islam failed multiculturalism in Britain. Now, would you...
Well, if you raise the issue of Islam...
I'm talking about radical Islam. If you know where to draw the line.
You're going to touch on these big issues as what lies behind this, all right. And if we just take General Wesley Clark after 9/11, and he said, we're going to attack 7 countries, right? And they were Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Lebanon, Sudan, and Iran. And if you then say what lies behind that, and it's quite clear the only thing which explains it all is in fact the Zionist desire to smash up every single independent nation throughout the Middle East. And that is the great push which at the moment, it's not even economic, it is people fleeing for their lives. Now if I take one example, in Lebanon at this moment, Lebanon has a population of just over 4 million and 1.2 million are refugees, okay? And that means over a quarter of that small country is now refugees. If that was the UK, that would mean 17 million refugees in the UK at this moment. So in all these big issues, we have to go back to what is the fundamental cause. And you look at the Middle East at the moment, Syria, go beyond, go to Afghanistan, go to Iraq, go to Libya. You're looking at a deliberately Western-created disaster area.
We get to that, but back to multiculturalism in Britain. Has it failed? Has it succeeded? It is celebrated, we do know, but back to my question, has radical Islam failed it?
Radical Islam is the result of a combination of a complete failure to find a modern radical Islamic solution for which youth can address and feel at home. It is also a combination of the West combining with the elites to smash the democratic aspirations of the people. Radical Islam is not something which is evil out there. It is a deep psychological reaction to what we have created and which we are making worse by stimulating the action and paying for and arming the actual groups, which has been a British policy, American policy, Israeli policy, and Saudi policy.
Mr. Bell, when it comes to, again, Muslim immigrants, obviously it's a fact that many of them are from largely Muslim countries. Do you think this has been one factor when it comes to this whole sense of worry when it comes to them invading Britain?
I think it is certainly portrayed as that. David Cameron's speech, which you referred to, somehow suggested that Islam is in of itself problematic, and this approach is fundamentally intolerant and is against the best traditions in our society. But I think that if you're going to wage war against Muslim countries, you'll probably find yourself waging war against Muslims at home. And the facts are, however, that the Muslim community continues to suffer relative disadvantage, despite multiculturalism, relative disadvantage on most social measures in terms of employment, education, housing, and so on. And the continued demonisation of the Muslim community is a convenient scapegoat for the failure of the government to address many problems. It's therefore then not surprising if young Muslims find themselves with a perspective of limited options and being patronised, talked down to, and seeing policies which often, particularly foreign policies, which we regard as abuse of the Muslim community. So I think that it is entirely consistent with what the British government is doing abroad, is their attempt to marginalise Muslims in this country.
And now we are joined by Fry Hughes, political activist and commentator, joining us from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Welcome to our discussion.
Hello, Carl.
Mr. Hughes, do you associate with the Prime Minister's rhetoric when it comes to handling the migrant crisis here in Britain?
No, absolutely. I think it's a disgrace that the Prime Minister of the country, who's supposed to be a leader and showing leadership, is allowing himself to use rhetoric, including like sending out the army, as if the problem with immigration should be treated on a war footing.
And would you be able to tell us about what you think was the root cause when it comes to this, and who is responsible in your opinion?
Okay, well, if you're referring to the actual problem of immigration in itself, I would obviously allude to British and Western foreign policy in the Middle East. If you look at the countries and backgrounds of the people who are trying to migrate to Britain, and remember, it's a humanitarian crisis. It's a call by the people who are really seeking security and safety, because there's no security in their homeland, there's no safety in their homeland. There's actually been a complete breakdown of law and order in Libya and Afghanistan, Eritrea and Sudan. So the Western powers that are actually interfering in the internal politics of Africa and the Middle East are responsible for the crisis.
Sibel, do you agree roughly that he's pointing out that it's mainly foreign policy, which is actually the subject of our next section? But would you name anyone when it comes to that, just as a...
I would agree that the reason that, for example, there are 3 times as many attempts by refugees to cross the Mediterranean in 2014 than in 2011 is exactly because of Western foreign policy in the Middle East since 2011.
How do you see things evolving when it comes to Calais? Were a Labour government in office here in Britain today, do you think it would have been different?
Well, I think it's a very apt question when you consider that Jeremy Corbyn is actually in the lead for the polls.
What would have Jeremy Corbyn done today if he were Prime Minister?
I don't know. It's a question obviously you would have to ask Jeremy Corbyn, but I'd like to think that he would follow the advice that's coming from Juncker, who's the President of the European Union, that there should be every country that's signed up to the European Union should accept a quota of refugees. The problem is the British are basically refusing to accept any refugees as part of the crisis of the hundreds of thousands that are fleeing these war-torn environments to come to Europe. So, I mean, there's only 4,000 or 5,000 people at Calais. It's a minimal amount. If the British government is spending something like 12 billion in security to prevent the people coming into the country, perhaps with a proper immigration policy for asylum-seeking refugees, that money could be spent on creating a better environment and a better quality of life for people who are fleeing. It's not just teenagers. This are people of young families and aging parents. This is a humanitarian crisis that any government in the world should step up to help these people in their hour of need.
And you mentioned quality of life, Mr. Hughes. Now, here in Britain, a lot of online tweets and comments, which, as part of our role in the media, we will, cast a light on them. Some of them say that this influx of unskilled refugees threatens, quote, our way of life here in Britain. What do you feel in Northern Ireland about this? Is this the same overall attitude when it comes to the right, of course?
Yes, you're going to find in any nation where there is a shortage of resources, and that because of the way wealth is distributed in society, there is an unequal share of wealth that goes to the top 1%, 2%, 10% in society, which means the people on the bottom, that's the working poor, the people living in poverty, the people with lack of education, are fighting over the minimal resources that are left to the lower strata of society. So when new people come in, it's very easy for people on the right who are racist anyway and xenophobic, Islamophobic, many of them are homophobic. They don't want to share their living space, their workspace, or their community environments with people from another culture, tradition, and a different set of values. So very easy for the right, very easy for politicians to use immigration, which is a minuscule, has a minuscule effect on drains, on social welfare payments, and taking jobs and fighting for resources. It's very easy to play the blame game and actually distract people from what they should be fighting for, which is coming together to fight as the working class and the middle class for better services, public services for all, including people who should be welcome as immigrants in this country. Very easy to play the blame game, distract people from what's really happening, and say that the bogeyman is not only used to be the Irish, now it's the Muslims. God knows who it will be when the West decides they want to invade India or China or Russia in several years.
Fry Hughes, political activist and commentator, joins us from Belfast in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much for being on the show again.
Thank you, Corn.
Professor Shakespeare, were Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister today, what would you guess he would have done?
I think he'd do 3 things. The first is that he would say that we are part of Europe at this moment, and that we would have to take a share of the now millions pressing in on Europe one way or another. Take a country like Italy. It's in very, very serious trouble. Secondly, he would combine that with, at the moment, he would actually combine that with physical naval moves against the traffickers, which are disgraceful the boats are coming in and ending up and putting 300 into the water, this sort of thing. But the big issue, though, where he would actually take on Europe, taking on the right wing, take on Europe, but that he would address in a big way the cause of all this great influx.
Which we will get to in our
Which
next
we'll
section.
get back into in our next section.
But you mentioned Italy being in a not very good state with the influx. Now, does that not justify the right's concerns when it comes to immigrants in England?
The right has a very limited view of things.
You said also Italy is in trouble because of...
Italy is in trouble because, Lampedusa is the island where, it's just quite an impossible situation for that. And when you put peoples under too much stress, they do tend to get nasty, however you view that. And the situation now throughout Europe, and there is coming a great big economic collapse, the situation is getting nasty, and you have to address that. The other thing that Jeremy Corbyn would do, he would use the national money supply, interest-free, in the first instance, for public capital projects. And that will actually get the jobs going and get the genuine income in the hands of the population. That mechanism can be used in 7 other ways. He's capable of a radical new economic policy because the great political revolt is building in Europe. So Jeremy Corbyn couldn't solve it overnight. He will take more people in. He will also at the same time try to damp down some of those humanitarian disasters, but he will address the big issues, which is foreign policy coming from Steve over there, and the massive collapse of economic policy, which is the other side.
Many of the migrants coming into the UK are from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, even Iran, Syria and Iraq, a few other countries as well, all of which are not bordering with Europe and not across the Mediterranean from the UK. So they have crossed quite a few miles before invading Britain. Throughout their trafficking, people smugglers operate in a few hubs, mainly in Libya, where they take advantage of the anarchy there and hardly equipped coast guards. Professor Shakespeare, let's talk Libya and tell us exactly how is this related to what is happening in Calais today?
Well, just looking at Libya, this country indulged itself in smashing up yet another country. We've turned it into chaos. One of the consequences is, of course, the rise of ISIL throughout that. But it has opened up a weak spot in which all the other migrants and forces are able to come through, and then of course they're in the hands of slave traders and traffickers. And you combine that with an inadequate maritime presence, and you've got a flood of people dying across the passage across the Mediterranean. But it is that we collapsed Libya, and then behind it our part in the other collapses in the areas, in the other countries.
And Stephen Bell, do you agree that Britain's foreign policy was the root cause behind what's happening today?
The NATO intervention in 2011 in Libya destroyed a sovereign state, so that now you have a position where there are 2 parliaments, 2 governments, 1,000 militias, collapse of the oil industry, huge discrimination against Africans, and a chaotic society which is incapable of controlling its own frontiers. For David Cameron to suggest that there is some quick fix that he can achieve after he had paraded as the victor and as this was a successful mission, this surely ranks as a huge event of hypocrisy. So the only way that the British government can start to resolve this problem if it acknowledges its own failures. At the moment, it is sending more armed personnel to Syria than it is receiving Syrian refugees.
The Prime Minister did say that foreign policy plays part in what is happening today. So that was a big statement. He's admitting somehow something went wrong.
Yes, and he then ignores it. Having accepted responsibility, he then passes it on, saying it's all down to people traffickers and so on. But the British government has accepted, in the past 12 months, 187 refugees from Syria. In the same period, Germany has accepted 30,000. Since 2011, Sweden has accepted 40,000 Syrian refugees. As I said, at the moment, we learnt that the British government has sent 120 SAS members to take part in military action under American leadership inside Syria, sent 20 RAF personnel, and backed this up with over 200 other specialists in communications. Now, that is more than the number of Syrian refugees that they have accepted, and this is in complete defiance of the decision of Parliament in 2013 not to engage in military action in Syria. So they are creating more Syrian refugees, and a third of those attempting a crossing in 2014, attempting crossing the Mediterranean, were Syrians.
Before we get into the role of Stop the War Coalition, you mentioned Germany obviously taking way more when it came to Syrian refugees. Now again, the economy over there is largely industrial, which is a sign that it's healthy, so as compared to the UK's economy, which is more relying on banking and brokerage and the service sector and retail. Now obviously, is that maybe a reason why Germany is taking more, because it needs people more and it can absorb them better than the UK?
Well, it has a higher rate of investment than the UK economy. The real problem with the UK economy is not the number of people in the country, it's the failure of private capital to invest, and it is the refusal of the government to use the extremely low interest rates to promote public services and industries which can employ and expand the economy. Instead, they want to keep the economy bumping along so that wages are low, profits are high, and they don't really care about the living standards of the vast majority of the population.
Back to Libya and Stop the War Coalition, did you see it going that way back then, before the...
In 2011, we warned that this would be chaos. Libya, prior to 2011, had the highest living standards, according to UN Human Development Index, of any country in Africa. Yes. That has been completely destroyed. And of course that has created large numbers of refugees. We anticipated, of course no one knew the extent of the destruction. How could you anticipate the extent of the destruction of Iraq, for example? Still today in 2015, large parts of Iraq don't have electricity. Ridiculous. But these are the supposed successes of foreign policy, and an adjunct to that is the huge displacement of people from these countries.
Professor Shakespeare.
Yes, well, quickly on Syria, if there's an election, President Assad would be elected overwhelmingly. Western policy can only have one consequence, which will have to be an ISIL state there. And you have to say, why is it that in practice, all the way around, with the aid of Turkey, ISIL is effectively being aided and abetted to do it? And you have to answer that. And the only thing which makes logical sense, which explains policy right in the area with the huge consequences for these millions now of displaced persons, is that the West is implementing a policy to smash up every independent state in the Middle East. And it has done that very, very well indeed. Iraq was smashed up. The Bremer orders, of course, were to take it over and to colonialize it, but to smash it up was number one. It was about creating war on 7 countries. Syria is another, Libya is another, Lebanon is being smashed into blazes, particularly by the sheer number of migrants there. Sudan, absolute chaos. It's Western policy, we're responsible for it, and Cameron should keep his big mouth shut and stand up and say, well, we created it, and we're now going to turn around.
We do respect your opinion on that. Now, were it a Labour government today again, and do you think the policy is something that Britain can reconcile ever when it comes to Libya? UK foreign policy, or do you think it's just irreversible and Libya has lost its trust in the West in general and the UK in particular?
Well, I think the Middle East, the populace, there are some elites still there, which in fact have, well, even they're losing trust. Saudi Arabia may be a case in point, but the mass of people don't trust now the West at all. The trouble is now they're absolutely being forced into chaos. And so I'm afraid I think it's bad news, and as things are, it's going to get worse.
And did you, staying in Libya, did you see, what are your comments on Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi when he pointed fingers at the West, that they invaded Libya for its wealth?
Yes, well, the West wants to get him killed because of he is one of the sort of sources of information as to what the West was truly up to, which is why they want him dead. Yes.
So when it comes to migrants again, and when some always argue, especially the right again, that they come to Europe and especially the UK and Germany, for example, because of benefits, because of the wealth of the welfare state and all that. Now, why wouldn't they go to wealthier countries like the UAE or...
People will never leave the land of their birth, whether it's their psychology and their identity is created as they grow up, etc. They won't do that unless they come under severe pressure. And the pressure can be of three sorts. It can be, say, political, and it can be religious, and it can be economic. And in all those three examples today, there is a solution, but the West does not wish to actually go for it. And time again, we take a very narrow view. We just deal with elites to suppress the interests of the mass of the population.
Mr. Bell, what needs to be done to protect Britain's economy and reassure the people here who are worried about their jobs? If the immigrants were to be absorbed into the system, how would they be handled in a way that doesn't threaten people's job here?
Well, there is, last year there were 400,000 people moved to Britain. So Britain, in the general sense, does not have a problem assimilating large numbers of people. There are economic problems in Britain, but these are down to the government maintaining a policy of austerity, which means that large amounts of national resources are not utilised to develop the economy. Instead, the priority is the rate of profit. However, there is no reason why Britain cannot take more. You have a position where there's only 5,000 people in Calais, and the preposterous notions of sort of sending sort of more dogs, more fences, more CCTVs. No, simply address the problem. We can accept these people into citizenship, and I'm sure they will more than pay their way in their attitude to their new country. That's the evidence of history, and the British government refuses to acknowledge history. The UN Special Representative for Migration, Peter Sutherland, commented on the British government's attitude to Calais, that they have forgotten the lessons of the fight against the Nazis, because the same papers who in the 1930s were squealing against Jewish refugees from Hitler's Germany coming here are the same papers who are squealing about refugees in Calais today.
And so when it comes to fencing, you touched on fencing. Let me actually address Professor Shakespeare. Is it not wiser perhaps to tackle the issue at its home instead of building fences here between Calais and Britain? What do you think about funding those very underdeveloped coast guards in Libya? We've seen a report recently about how underdeveloped they are there.
It's going to be essential to increase the maritime resources, because if you don't, you're going to have what happened yesterday or the day before. You're going to have 200 or 300 people in the water. That is a narrow issue and an absolutely vital in humanitarian ones. But much more widely, you're going to have to deal with the big issue, which is getting much, much worse. And It will have. It's going to have bigger consequences in European politics, where a revolt is on, and this is going to be one of the factors in increasing that revolt.
As this episode comes to an end, let me thank our guest today. Mr. Fry Hughes joined us from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and of course our studio guest, Professor Rodney Shakespeare, renowned non-mainstream British political commentator, and Mr. Stephen Bell of Stop the War Coalition and commentator as well. Thank you very much for being again on the show. Stay tuned to Levant TV Straightforward, and I'll be with you again soon. Thanks for watching, and bye for now. The deliveries it tries to make through the tunnel are now successful. Drivers queued for more than a mile to reach the ferry terminal, while migrants were seen walking along the side of the road. Let me welcome first our guest here at the studio, Professor Rodney Shakespeare. Thank you very much for being on the show, Professor of Binary Economics and renowned British non-mainstream commentator. And Mr. Stephen Bell of Stop the War Coalition and political commentator. Thank you very much for being on the show again. Before we get into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report on the crisis in Calais.
More than 1,700 attempts to cross the Eurotunnel to Britain were stopped overnight on Sunday. This comes as the UK announced new measures to crack down on desperate migrants attempting to cross over from Calais. Last week, a Sudanese man in his 30s died, apparently crushed to death by a lorry, and at least 10 people have been killed since June trying to get through the Channel Tunnel to Britain. Earlier this week, Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond announced that Britain is to fund an extra 100 border guards at the Channel Tunnel terminal on the French side.
The word swarms, which was used by the Prime Minister, has the effect of stimulating resentment amongst the population. On the one hand, the right wing, and particularly the right wing press, uses this image and this language to say that we're about to be invaded by the barbarian hordes at the gates of the UK. And then the left react to that, pointing out that the issue is much bigger, much wider than what is there. I would just point out that in terms of what is happening on the big scale, one asylum applicant in the UK, and it's 9 in Germany, and it's 33 in Hungary. So before we get going off and saying what's happening, we've got to do something, etc., we have to remember that something on a much bigger scale is happening, and there are bigger issues as to whether the UK has a part in that. So the immediate thing is, though, of panic, exacerbated by the press, particularly by the right-wing press, but they are failing to see the much bigger, wider picture.
Could it be perhaps because the style of applying for asylum visas in Germany or the other countries that you mentioned is different than just crossing the border forcefully, destroying the fence and coming into your country?
The UK has natural fortress advantages. It's called the English Channel, right? But it is still part of Europe, the UK. And there are agreements and practices. And this is going to have to be addressed, including the question of, with this great flood of migrants in Europe, it's there right the way through now, is that the UK is going to have to say whether or not it does.
Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political talk show brought to you by me, Harry Khaweli. The recent migrant crisis on Britain's border in Calais has raised a lot of concerns in the country. Security concerns, economic losses, and most importantly, a humanitarian issue. How are these migrants ending up at the UK border? What is France doing about it? And how is it best to tackle this invasion from Britain's perspective? And should this be dealt with here or at its source, where human trafficking is taking place? Philip Hammond, the British Foreign Secretary, said the government has a grip on the migration crisis in Calais. French police claimed British anarchists living there are manipulating migrants into using more aggressive tactics. The chaos is costing British businesses hundreds of millions of pounds, one reporting just a fifth of all.
As he said, the government has got a grip on the Calais migrant crisis. Hammond also announced that Britain and France would intensify their efforts for a more robust approach by the European Union to return migrants to their countries of origin and attempt to discourage migrants from travelling to Europe in the first place. More than 2,000 migrants have died trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe this year, according to the International Organization for Migrants. The organization says around 188,000 people have been rescued so far this year trying to cross the Mediterranean, and warned that the 200,000 mark could be crossed by the end of the week. Between 3,000 and 5,000 migrants are reported to be camped out in Calais waiting for a chance to cross to Britain. And the International Organization for Migrants has urged Europe to seek broader long-term measures to address the wider migrant crisis affecting the continent.
Professor Shakespeare, tell us about the media coverage of Calais between far left and far right. What do you think?
Well, those images, when they're combined with heavily emotive language, for example,